Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's MS-ISAC National Web Cache Initiative. Sex, Lies, and Mobile Devices, the Seedy Underworld of Mobile Insecurity. Just a few webcast reminders. In order to view your screen at full screen, simply hit the double arrows on the top right corner of your screen, and that will allow you to make your slides full screen. To ask a question, click on the question mark icon on the right-hand side of your screen as well. Type in your question and make sure that all panelists are selected on the bottom and hit the send button. We will do our best to answer all questions. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Reg Harnish. Reg is the CEO of GreyCastle Security, a leading cybersecurity risk assessment, advisory, and mitigation firm headquartered in Troy, New York. As CEO of GreyCastle, Reg is responsible for defining and executing the company's vision. Under his leadership, the company has experienced 6 consecutive years of triple-digit growth and countless industry accolades. Today, GreyCastle Security is working with organizations in nearly every state in the U.S. Reg is a nationally recognized speaker and has presented at countless industry events. He was recently recognized as the 2017 Cybersecurity Consultant of the Year by the Cybersecurity Excellence Awards and has been featured in Time, Forbes, CBS Nightly News, The Washington Post, Dark Readings, and others. Reg is a member of the Forbes Technology Council and a fellow of the National Cybersecurity Institute in Washington, D.C. Reg, are you there?
All right, I'm here. Yeah,
oh,
so I think that's my cue. So thank you for the warm introduction. I appreciate it, and thank everyone for spending their time here today for really a risk and an issue that I think has gone under-addressed in many ways, even though the problems are highly visible, and that much of these activities, the concerns, the functions are so tightly integrated into our life. In some ways, we don't even know that they're there. And something else I'll try to sort of touch on is whether or not we care that these things exist or that the risks exist with our mobile devices. This is pretty much the average American couple today, right? I can't say that it's not me in some ways. But what's happened with mobility and the ability, the power to bring the internet with us wherever we go, and including the bedroom, has really changed every part of our lives. When I think about, cybersecurity as an industry, in my lifetime, there's really been a few inventions that have changed everything about my life. And the way I think about data and privacy, communications and commerce. The first is the internet, of course, right? And the ability to connect computers together, connect devices together around the world really changed everything for us. It created new markets, it toppled governments, it's done many things. And the second one is the ability to take all of that power with us. From there, when we think about whether it's an iPhone or an Android, how far this technology has advanced, and just what we consider the Internet of Things and the types of devices that are now online and connected and communicating and sharing information together, that ecosystem, that mesh of data has really created some complexities, many of which go hidden because of the complexity of the nature as well. So What I'd like to do is kind of start and describe, from my perspective, what I see going on today, and some of the things that interest me or perhaps cause me to think differently about what I do with my device and the data. Because I remember a day I was talking to an associate at GreyCastle the other day. He's very young, graduated with a couple of bachelor's degrees from college at 17. And just a few days ago, someone had to actually explain to him how to send a letter in the postal mail, where to put the stamp, where to put the address, the return address. All of these things were foreign to him, and it was interesting and funny at the same time. But the underlying concept here for me was that really, how can we imagine how much things have changed? And it's dramatic today. And I imagine explaining a rotary phone to my daughter, who's now 15 months old, and the differences between, when I was a kid and to call someone, you actually had to make sparks in a mechanical device, and what we do today, it will probably almost be unexplainable. But today, right, we are where we are. And we see many organizations struggling with things like, a BYOD policy and how do they manage mobile devices, and certainly the security and privacy concerns for those devices. But I think the challenge is actually something different. I think for us, rather than trying to control the exposure of these activities and the data and the spread of these devices and their usage, I think for us the challenge is how do we operate in an environment where that's happening whether we like it or not. And I remember the conversations with CISOs and CIOs and CEOs when BYOD became a buzzword, and really the concern was, how do we control this? And I think in many ways what we figured out is that it's not controllable, and so what do we do to compensate for that? Now, as it turns out, really, the mobile device has supported, in many ways, surveillance. And surveillance is truly the business model of the internet. If you think about most of the activities, the apps, the functions, the services, the websites that you utilize from a mobile device, most of them are about collecting data or sharing data, so one way or another. These providers, though, whether it's Twitter and LinkedIn and social media, it's the federal government, it's your mobile carrier, their job is collecting data about you. And in many cases, you know about this data collection, and you may have some sense of how the data is being used for you or about you, and in some ways to your advantage. And of course, many of these things go missed. They're either not communicated, or they're confusing, or the complexity keeps us from actually understanding what data gets shared when, about who, and what's being done with it. So we think about 1984, right? Well, as it turns out, George Orwell was a bit of an optimist. The kinds of surveillance that are going on today in our society are simply too vast and too complex to calculate. There's too much. And in fact, entire industries have become successful doing nothing more than collecting your data, processing it, and selling it back to you or selling it to a third party. And that's all they do. Think about Facebook, who charges no admission or application fee. There's no membership cost for Facebook. So you have to imagine, where do they generate billions of dollars in revenue? Well, most of it comes from selling data about you, whether it's the length of your password, or it's the structure, the physical structure of your face. All of these things have become data that has become very, very valuable. Now, as we know, consumerism drives privacy, and privacy drives security. There might be a compliance checkbox in there somewhere, but the reality is that this wave, this pressure on us to continue to support conveniences and freedoms, whether it's in shopping for hiking boots or it's selfies with VIPs, all of this information and all of this pressure has created a vacuum for us. And that vacuum is insecurity, because oftentimes the security concerns regarding this data and these devices is either not considered, or it's considered too late, or once again, the complexity of the mechanism is such that we can't possibly comprehend that. So as we think about building cybersecurity programs, particularly around protecting data on mobile devices or the Internet of Things, we have to remember that the root of this, right, and the root exposure and the root pressures of these concerns are in consumerism. And there are obviously many more consumers than there are folks working at your organization. That said, each of those consumers is exerting pressure on you and your cybersecurity program as it relates to mobility. Now, this really became a big story back, a year and a half ago now-ish, when Apple and the FBI were battling over control, or really control of the data that existed on a single iPhone. And we saw these two factions create major divisiveness in our society because, the same security control, in this case, encryption, was causing folks to be paranoid and was keeping law enforcement from doing their job. So if you considered yourself a patriot and on the side of order, then perhaps you were siding with the FBI and you were wondering why Apple wouldn't just provide access to or a password for or some compromise for that device so that the FBI could prosecute what was at that point really understood as a terroristic activity. And on the other side, if you're into freedom and convenience and sort of the liberalities of mobile devices, you may have been on Apple's side and wondering why the FBI, by requesting access to this device, would be willing to compromise the security and privacy of every citizen that owned an iPhone. But there really was no right answer. And I think what's happening is that mobility and really the data on these mobile devices has created a lot of problems that we could not have really projected or thought of in advance. This simply brought a lot of these conversations to the forefront. Now, data collection isn't just being done by the government. We could go on for a long time talking about the NSA's bulk wholesale surveillance programs and what other governments and nation states are doing to understand their citizens and terrorism and those kinds of things. But for me, I'm actually less worried about the NSA than I am my grocery store. When I think about the one organization, perhaps besides Amazon.com, that knows the most about me, it's my grocery store. When I think back 10 years ago, grocery stores were collecting information, and they actually used that information so that they could intelligently restock their shelves after I had been to the store and bought a can of soup. 5 years ago, they got better at using this data, and they were actually able to project what I was going to buy on a given day, right, or a given season, or a given location, really largely from the same data. They just got better at processing it. Now today, my grocery store knows everything about me. It knows when I'm sick. It knows when I'm on a diet. It knows how often I wash my hair. It actually even knew who I was going to vote for president before I did. They can do this by creating profiles of conservative voters, liberal voters, Republican, Democrat, and they have this information. And this has become an entire revenue stream for these organizations. And so again, when I think about the invasion or the intrusion on my privacy, I'm actually less worried about Big Brother and the feds than I am my local grocery store. And it's really starting to change. So now, not only is my data being collected transactionally, meaning if I rent a car or I buy a book, which is data that we sort of knew we were trading, and that privacy became a currency. So we were willing to exchange our information for the conveniences of freedoms or maybe even products and services. But today, lots of things are happening without our knowledge. A couple of these that become very interesting, which is Wi-Fi marketing and beacon marketing, something that is actually rather new. In the case of connecting to a wireless network, certainly we can geolocate that IP address and have a general sense of where that user is physically. Beacon marketing takes that quite a bit further. There's a couple of different variants of this, but actually your phone, whether you know it or not, is actually beaconing out to services that through Bluetooth and other types of connectivity can determine your exact location, really within that actual lane in a grocery store. Are you in front of the soup or are you in front of the paper towels? And actually deliver to you targeted marketing around the products that you're actually seeing at that moment. And in addition to that, the other inbound beacon marketing, which actually may be sending sounds through a TV commercial to your phone so that vendors, manufacturers, retailers can track how many times have you heard their message. And this is happening all the time on a continuous basis, and it's happening really without our knowledge. And in some cases, our phone is a willing and complicit victim, primarily because we've asked it to do certain things. And it's no different than a phone call. If you think about this, the mobile device needs to give away some of your information to do its job, meaning if you disallowed or disabled triangulation on your device, well, guess what? The cell tower cannot deliver a call to you. And the same is true of data as well. If we didn't provide it certain information, we couldn't get texts or connect to our favorite app or collect points at the local deli as a frequent shopper. And so the different types of marketing that are going on out there are fascinating. I actually encourage anyone who's interested in the privacy conversation to look into things like beacon marketing to see just how much is being collected about you and how it's being processed. It's truly fantastic. Now, we have continued to leverage our mobile device because it's always on us, it's convenient, it's small, it's portable, and it does everything we need it to do. So we're asking it to do even more, and in this case, credentials, right? So today, I use an iPhone and I use Touch ID for a number of different applications because it's convenient, it's easy, I can do it while I'm driving, unfortunately. But now, the phone has become really a repository for my vital signs and for really things that are unique to me, things like fingerprints and retina patterns. And so all of this information continues to get pushed into a device that isn't very good at keeping secrets, and in fact is actually accessible by third parties, both illegally, and that happens sometimes, but contractually. We actually give these third parties permission to do this. And anyone who's actually read through a Verizon or an AT&T carrier contract knows just how much of this data is actually accessible to them. And really, it's everything. There's almost nothing that's off limits to a carrier. And of course, their story is that they're using it to deliver better service and to improve the user experience. But fingerprints is just another example of something that is now central to our mobile devices. And mobile devices have gotten very good at predicting things as well, right? So today, your iPhone, your Android actually knows when you're depressed or when you're in a bad mood. It knows and can compare the way you walk, right? So the gyrometer, the gyroscope, the accelerometer in your device can actually compare the way you're walking today, one, with how you walked over the last week, right? Take a trend and compare, we can see the difference. Maybe you're walking more slowly, or maybe you're anxious, maybe you're walking more quickly. And then it can compound that information with, well, what did they just buy online, right? Are they spending more time on Facebook or connecting with friends via social media because they're lonely? And they can actually project or predict how you're feeling that day at that moment. And there's been studies done that actually show, in some cases, that the device knows more about you than you do. In fact, you might actually say, I'm going to do a little quick self-assessment here, and I feel like I'm a 9 out of 10 today. But your phone actually knows better how you're feeling, whether you're depressed or disappointed or happy or anxious or excited. And all this information, again, is available to this privacy ecosystem, this exchange of information online. There are there's new legislation out there that will allow law enforcement to use your mobile device to determine if you were texting while driving or if you were driving while disabled or impaired. And simply by polling that metadata that you gave your carrier and law enforcement access to when you didn't read the contract, and actually can plug it into something called the textualizer. So for example, today in New York State, this is almost a law. I know it's at least a bill, and I'm not exactly sure when this might actually become a law, but there's a device called the textualizer. You get pulled over, you hand your device to the officer, the officer plugs it in to the textualizer. The textualizer actually reads all the metadata about your texts, as well as your GPS coordinates. It can actually quite easily stitch those things together and say, clearly this individual was texting while they were driving, while they were in motion. Secondarily, when they're pulling you out of the car and asking you to do a sobriety test, they can actually compare your gait, your stability, your balance to what you were, so your average metrics over the past week, and compare those. And if it seems like you're more volatile, your data is suggesting that you're more volatile at the moment, well, that's one more piece of evidence to suggest that you've been driving while impaired. And again, it's all central to our mobile device, something that we've given complete control over our life to. Now, I've been talking about mobile phones, right? Typically the iPhone and the Android, but this goes way beyond this. And for us, mobility is really anything that can persist or communicate or share or collect data that can be carried, right? A mobile device, it was never really constrained to a phone, even though those tend to be popular. But now we're seeing things like goggles and wearables, and smart shirts and smart vests or luggage. There's all sorts of things that can be portable that actually act just like your mobile device. They have apps, they collect data, they share data, they have configuration and security and privacy settings. And at the same time, retailers, nation states, and everyone in between are collecting this information so that they can certainly, of course, create a better user experience for you and improve their services, but also so that they can resell that information about you and make money. Again, Google's a great example. So we think about, the Google optics that are available now. The most important thing, that the revenue that they generate from selling these devices is actually quite uninteresting to Google. What is interesting is pairing that data up with an ID, right, an identity, who you are specifically, along with your search histories and your browser, visitations and the kind of information that you've interacted with Google on, to create a more complete picture of all of the world's data. When you think about it, Google has access to 90% of all of the world's data. And this becomes one more, things like your heart rate or the temperature of your skin or how many steps you've walked in the last 24 hours, right? So wearables and mobile devices are now moving away from the phone, right? My phone is actually kind of cumbersome, and I've got an old iPhone 6. The thing is too big, it gets in the way, it's just hanging out there on my belt. I'd like a better user experience. And what am I willing to exchange for that experience? There's plenty of other examples here too as well. So just read an article recently about the Roomba, who later models are actually collecting data about your house, right? The floor plan, the square footage, whether or not you've got furniture, do you have pets, and selling that information. Now what you probably didn't know is when you bought the Roomba, you only bought the device. You did not buy the data that it collects. And so there's actually no way to opt out of this. These devices are now selling information about your house. So if you've got a Roomba and you've got a room that you haven't put stuff in yet, and you start seeing ads from Amazon for furniture for a room about the size of yours, it's not a coincidence. It's that this information is being sold by these organizations and utilized in ways that are supposed to make your life more convenient and more free. John Deere tractors. So there's a big story about 6 months ago, because the tires in later model John Deere tractors actually have devices in them that will collect soil conditions and temperatures and humidity and precipitation, and it sends all of that information back to John Deere. Now, the argument was, well, if I buy a John Deere tractor, I'm buying a license. I own that thing. I should have control of everything it does. But farmers did not know that inside that John Deere tractor was a wireless access point, a 3G access point, that was sending back information about their mileage, how often the tractors were run, engine temperatures, as well as soil conditions. And of course, this was all to promote better agriculture services and process, and really for the betterment of science and technology in agriculture. So there's a big issue here, right? And the question around this is, well, who owns that data on this mobile device, in this case, which is a 3-ton John Deere tractor. Now, the last example I'll give is one that I just ran across a couple of days ago. So this is the Lioness, and yes, it is what you think it is. It's categorized for, I guess, for family consumption as a personal discovery device, but it actually collects information about the female experience, right? how long, what was the temperature of the room, heart rate changes, and it actually sells all that information back, again, in the spirit of creating a better experience. But I can't think of anything more invasive or more intrusive than a device like this that is connected via Bluetooth to my mobile device, and my mobile device, of which, of course, is sharing my heart rate, the number of times, usage, battery, length, battery life, and really every detail about my usage of these devices, not necessarily mine, but you sort of get the point. The last point I'll make here is that mobility is really no longer the right term. For us, this is, in some cases, it's an ambience, meaning it's kind of like the oxygen that we breathe in the sense that it's everywhere. Everything we interact with, or in some cases don't interact with, is collecting data, because data is power, right? And data is worth a lot of money. And so we need to, I believe, sort of step back and think about where we've come, because many of these things do create massive conveniences and freedoms for us and better user experiences. That said, what are we willing to compromise, right? What are we willing to give up? When we think about privacy and security as currencies in this sort of new world, we've not had a chance to really do the math and think about what all of this is worth. So how does this break down, right? So I put it into 5 categories for mobility and really the issues around privacy and security for mobile devices, everything from John Deere tractors to the Galaxy Note. The first is this, right? That whether you're on the side of the NSA and surveillance and you appreciate improvements in user experiences, or you're a sort of a privacy stalwart and you don't want anyone collecting information about anything or anything about you, it doesn't matter. The reality is you didn't have the ability to opt out, right? You cannot consent, and even in cases where you are opting out, the fact that you've opted out is information that they've collected about you so that they, once again, can sell you more stuff or improve your user experience or create a profile for other users, right? So opting out, not an option anymore. The reality is that we're in this inescapable ecosystem of privacy, data, and the vulnerabilities that exist on our devices around security configurations and wireless networks and social media, and there's no way to escape. So consent has become a real issue, because if you were to read all of the agreements for all of the apps and all of the devices that use, studies suggest that it would take you about 7 years if you read 8 hours a day, just like a job. But it's not really possible, right? We can't actually understand or comprehend and certainly make good decisions about the devices and the data that we carry around with us in ways that support my perspectives and my opinions about security and privacy. We simply can't consent. And the next is this, right? So again, whether or not you're on the side of bulk wholesale surveillance or you much more appreciate privacy, right? Were you Apple or were you the FBI? The reality is, in most cases, you don't even know that this is going on, right? There's very little transparency in mobility today. And certainly the security and the privacy concerns, it's not like someone is coming to you, whether it's Facebook or LinkedIn or it's your grocery store, and saying, hey, listen, not only is this the data that we're going to collect about you, but here's how we're going to process it, here's how we're going to make money on that, and here's the best way for you to opt out of that system or to remove consent, so to speak. There's just none of that going on. Or it's being done in ways that it's impossible to discover, right? So even if you're looking for this information so that you can make good decisions, it's not transparent enough for the average citizen to make a good decision, nor will they really even know where to look for it. Next is this. I hear all the time about, certainly there's plenty of stories that suggest people feel more empowered online, whether it's in a chat session or it's a Facebook post, right? We feel like we can really speak our minds online because there's a computer and distance between me and the other individual. And so there's a real feeling of anonymity. The reality is, however, is very different. And actually, in that case, the internet is the most logged and monitored medium in the history of humankind. Right? If we go back to things like stone tablets and hieroglyphics, you were either in the room or you weren't, and it was very binary. There was no way to monitor communications. You couldn't even make a copy of it because it was etched into a tablet. And so, anonymity has become a real issue. And in fact, even in cases where there are technologies, things like the Tor network and onion routing and other things, even if you are using that, you are put on another list, right? One of the ways the FBI and other law enforcement tracks down cyber criminals is by looking for Tor traffic, right? So just the act of becoming anonymous makes you less anonymous. Become a real issue for us. One of the biggest issues, of course, is who owns the data, right? Whether it's the John Deere tractor collecting information about your lawn and your soil, or it's, Google Glass selling information about, your GPS coordinates, or it's something else. We aren't really sure who owns the data. And this goes much farther than the data that's on your phone or the tweets that you're willing to submit to the interwebs. This is about things like medical records, right? Your medical record, your patient information is actually spread out all over the place, the internet, and it's actually not yours. If you read the fine print, you'll learn that your PHI, your medical record, is actually owned by your providers, but what you get is a legal license to access it, right, and to make sure that it's correct. And you have some control over who may have access to it as well, but you don't own the record. In fact, there's now court precedent to suggest that you don't even own the structure of your own face. Like your picture, the way you look. Facebook has created some technology. I think it's called, I forget the actual name of the technology, but it's basically facial recognition. And it's so good at detecting who you are and identities, even if you're wearing a hat or your face is like partially obscured by the door of a car or something like that. It's like 99% accurate in terms of its accuracy and predictions. So there's been some court precedent over who owns the structure of your face or the way you look on a given day. Today we can't really own the data, and that makes it much harder for us to secure, right? So if you think about jewelry in your house, right? You can touch it, you know where it is, you put it in a safe, you can make real quick decisions on what the value of that thing is, and because of all of that, you know what you're willing to do to secure it. What about your data, right? You can't touch it. Maybe you don't even have access to it. You don't know who else may be exposed to it. You don't know what it's worth or how to replace it necessarily. And so because of this lack of ownership, we're not really sure how to secure the data. So even if I were to give you 100 suggestions on configurations for the iPhone 7, whether it's around near-field communications or encryption, the reality is you probably can't make good decisions because you don't even know what data I'm talking about. And that goes double for the metadata, right, which in many cases is pretty explicitly owned by whoever is generating that data, not necessarily the subject of that data. And then lastly, this, right? So trust has become a real issue because I think today we either trust too much or we trust too little. And risk management in human beings has been very successful for millennia, right? It's why we know how to, or why to not poke the bear and to not touch the fire, right? These are risk management decisions. But I think in many ways, the complexity, the simple, the sort of vastness of the issue has created an environment where we are complacent. And so we tend to trust things where maybe we shouldn't be. And then there's a real lack of trust around things like headlines, right? So comparing terrorism to texting while driving, right? So what's more dangerous, right? I'm guessing that very few of you have been affected directly by terrorism. In many cases, most of you don't even know someone who knows someone that's been affected directly by terrorism. But most of us have had some issues with distracted driving. It happens every single day, continuously. Yet most of our time and attention is placed on things that are out of our control, that seem very, seem like big headlines or are dramatic. And so managing trust and risk is become an issue simply from the sheer immensity of the issue. The last thing I'll last point I'll make about this is none of you care. And honestly, I'm smart enough to know that despite the hundreds of people that are on this webcast, the reality is when you get off here, you'll do exactly nothing different about the configuration of your mobile device or your John Deere tractor. And that's because it doesn't really matter today. And it doesn't matter because we're not exactly sure what the calculation looks like. But more importantly, think about it in terms of healthcare, I suppose, or immunity. Every society withstands a certain amount of sickness, right? Viruses, bacteria, they're everywhere, they're around us. But if I get a head cold, I don't die. And it's not until something much more severe persists that I'll actually even do something about it. So we're in survival mode now because the problem, believe it or not, is so small compared to what we're willing to or capable of withstanding that honestly today it doesn't really matter. And you can ask any millennial why they're checking in on Foursquare and putting pictures of their vacation up and announcing basically to the public that they're out of their apartment, so come rob me, that they'll generally tell you that they don't care. And I would tend to agree that that makes sense today. And I believe that we're just starting to scratch the surface in terms of how many mobile devices or how many collection points we have, or this ambience of data that we live in, just how intense and how vast it will become is sort of TBD at this point. But I think the risks obviously will increase over time, and probably our concern for those risks will increase as well. So let me leave you with a couple of final points. And I do many of these webinars, I do presentations all over the country, and oftentimes I'm asked to provide specific recommendations for our attendees. I want something that they can walk back to their office with. And that sounds great. The problem with that is without understanding and tailoring a solution for specific environment, assets, risk, risk tolerance, all of those things, it's difficult to provide specifics, particularly on a webcast like this where there are literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. So I'm going to leave with a couple of general thoughts that you should be able to take back and tailor for your own specific situation. The first is you got to understand your data. Today it's very difficult. In some cases, though, it is possible. And in the cases where it's possible, you need an inventory, whether it's in a spreadsheet or it's in your brain. Mine's in my brain. I would not go through the trouble of creating a spreadsheet of the data on my phone. But generally speaking, I know the data that's on my phone. And I'm counting things like email and pictures of my vacation and contact lists and phone numbers, maybe even my social security number, certainly by my biometrics and some credentials. And I have a general sense of, well, what's the value of these things, right? How do I determine whether or not the currency exchange is worth it? Well, I've got to put a value on the currency itself. And so understanding the data on your device becomes critically important, really the first step in terms of securing. If all you've got on your iPhone is Candy Crush, then maybe you don't need a 20-character password. But you can't make that decision until you understand what's on there. For many of us, it is a simple calculation. For some of us, it's much more complex. And for some, it's a no-brainer because really the only thing I'm doing with that thing is Spotify, and nothing really matters. The next is this, your connections, right? So for most of us, if you're using a modern smartphone, the connections are pretty obvious. You've got 2, 3, 4, maybe 5-ish connection types, most of which you have and know how to manually control, right? Things like Bluetooth and near field and wireless, et cetera. Those are the easy ones. Where it becomes less easy, I suppose, is in the implicit connections, right? So those are the downstream connections, the ecosystem behind those connections, right? So just connecting to a public Wi-Fi network, I may be very strict about, well, does it feel like it's a good password? Is it, WPA? Is it, sort of the things on the surface? The question really becomes is, in order to do that, what information do I actually give up, right? Because I am giving up my geolocation. I'm giving up the fact that I've connected there. And in many cases, people may not realize that this becomes a saved network, and my phone is beaconing out all the time. And in fact, you get in a room full of people, you can actually profile the vast majority of them just by their saved wireless networks, because your iPhone and your Android are looking for those networks each time. Well, all you got to do is create a database of those connection attempts, And you can get pretty specific with where people have been, whether, you know, in a subway in New York City or they were in a Starbucks in Seattle. You'll have all that information. And really, it has nothing to do with the security of your current connection, but rather implicitly the things that your device has to go through to even perform those functions in the first place. Again, that exchange of data to participate in society in a convenient, free way is largely misunderstood. But it really all comes down to this. This is about risk. And for the vast majority of us, we could throw our iPhone in the ocean and there really wouldn't be a whole lot lost. That said, keeping the phone is actually much more risky. And that's what most of us, well, I do hope to throw my phone in the Caribbean Ocean or Caribbean Sea one of these days. Today I've got to use it. I'm tethered to it. It's important to me. So I've got to understand the risk that's involved here. And you do that with two things, right? So what's the likelihood that one of these misconfigurations or the fact that I'm sharing information about my travel plans with a third-party website or I just bought USB devices from Amazon. All of these things, search histories, shopping habits, your GPS coordinates, all of these things create risk. We're going to think about, well, what's the likelihood of these things being compromised and used in ways that I don't want? Right, so impact is actually a lot easier. Likelihood is a little bit voodoo because it changes with every step that we take, almost quite literally. But without some calculation around risk, it's really tough to know how much time, energy, and money you should be spending on the security and privacy of your personal experience, your device, and the data. Make sure that risk is always at the center of your conversation when you think about, is this a problem or is it not a problem? Final point, I think a lot of this stems from the urgency that all of us feel, right? As Americans, we're always in a hurry, right? There's never enough time to do the things we're doing. We're flying through email, we're connecting to wireless networks without even meeting them. And we do it because there's a certain amount of expediency in our society and in our culture. John Adams, I think, is a great mentor because he was elected to the presidency because the Congress felt that literally, quote unquote, he was the most sensible man in Congress. And what that meant was he actually thought about things, right? He wasn't a great dancer, he didn't own wineries, or he wasn't a wealthy guy. And the Times or the Washington Post, not too long ago, did a story, a special story on his diary. And in his diary, there's a lot of detail, a lot of real hard emotion and transparency and raw experiences. But then every couple of days, there'd be an entire page that all it said was, at home thinking. And I think we just don't do enough of this today. I think most of us are fully qualified and capable of making good security and privacy and risk decisions about the data in our lives, whether it's on an iPhone or it's in a robot vacuum cleaner. And we generally understand likelihood and impact if we just think about it for a second. No different than social engineering issues where the average employee actually knows how to detect a phishing email, they don't commit the time, the 3 seconds to doing it. I think for us, at least where we are in this current evolution of risk around data on mobility, on mobile devices, this is an issue of time. And we're just not willing to take the time to do the things that I've described here, most of which can be done very quickly, and you completely have the capability and the intelligence to do. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. I appreciate your time today. I'll turn it back to Tammy and the team to see if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Reg. Yes, there are questions pouring in right now, so we will try to get to all of them. If we can't, we'll work something out on the back end to get them addressed. So the first question that came in when you were talking about the tracking with the supermarket, how well can I be tracked if, and it's a two-part question, I don't have location services turned on, or I am not connected to Wi-Fi or a cell tower?
Great question, and I would also suggest that this, regardless of those conditions, it's unavoidable because you're going to use a credit card in a certain lane at the grocery store. They're going to know the barcodes of every item that you bought, date and time stamps, location of the store, and a lot of the beaconing that's being done is certainly through Wi-Fi, but a lot of it is just through what's actually, I think it's called low volume Bluetooth, which is actually a Bluetooth signal that it doesn't go 30 yards, it only goes 10 feet or something, a much shorter distance. And by pinging these things off your Bluetooth receiver, it doesn't mean you're connecting to a Bluetooth network or connecting to a wireless network. It's the beaconing of that that can tell exactly where you are within a couple of feet and understand, of course, from the layout of the store, exactly what you've paused there to look at. So the short answer is you will be tracked, and spending time on tracking avoidance, I believe, is a waste of time. I think what you need to do, though, is figure out how much of an issue is it for you, and then figure out how to thrive in that environment, right? What I tell people is, listen, if you live in a volcano, don't spend all your time trying to avoid lava. It's like we need to figure out how to thrive and really do better in an environment where lava is everywhere. And I think that's the issue for us, is a completely different way of thinking. That said, I think there are some responsible things you can do about disabling connections and those kinds of things. You don't need it, don't use it, don't download the app. But some things you can't avoid. If you're going to use a mobile device in a grocery store, you're going to be tracked.
Okay, so to piggyback kind of off of that question, or that answer, I should say, question is, which do you turn off the Bluetooth, the settings do you turn off? Bluetooth, GPS, or phone?
So you would need to disable every radio in your device. So near field communication, Bluetooth, wireless, 3G, LTE, and those are really the primary four that are used for beaconing and tracking. There are other tracking devices that don't require a connection, though, things like your accelerometer, gyroscope, those kinds of things, where it's collecting information anyway. That said, that information is much more context sensitive and in some ways vague. But once you re-enable your wireless network Bluetooth connection, you connect back to a 3, 4G tower, that information is going to get sent anyways because it's collecting offline.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We have another question that came in right along on the same topic. So, does our specific phone ID get sent? Oh, sorry, another question just came in and kicked me out of that question. Get sent as a response to the low-power Bluetooth beaconing?
Not sure I understand the question.
Okay, so does our specific phone ID get sent as a response to the low power Bluetooth beaconing? I know that it kind of came in broken up, so yep. I don't know if that made more sense.
Yep. So your unique phone ID, your ESN, actually does get submitted with certain activities. Certainly any cellular connection, it's required. You can't receive or make calls without transmitting that information. For the Bluetooth beaconing, I actually kind of doubt it. Although that's an interesting question, and if it is, then certainly there are many more opportunities and possibilities for stitching all of that other data about your identity together. So good question. I will actually find out. I'm interested myself.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So next question is, what impact do you think GDPR will have on the collection of data that have been talked about here?
Well, I think it actually will have little impact in the near term. Most organizations have really don't have a good sense of what GDPR means for them, either from a security or privacy perspective or a legal perspective for that matter. But I do think that, the European Union is a leader in some ways in both protecting privacy and compromising the privacy of its citizens. So I'm kind of hoping that GDPR is not the model of the future, and I think it has overextended privacy requirements for organizations where the risk is low and the jurisdiction is questionable. But the GDPR conversation, that's not so much from a consumer perspective as it is for organizations, right? As a consumer, you have no GDPR requirements. As a business that is processing, storing, transmitting, creating information about a European Union resident, now you've got requirements. I guess it's to be determined, I think, at this point, to see how much impact a global requirement like GDPR will, one, be accepted and two, enforced, right? I don't see Germany sending a bunch of auditors over here to ensure that United States companies are, enforcing GDPR. Certainly not anywhere in the near term. So I would say that's very, very low risk at this point.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So this question is, what about the right to protection against illegal search and seizure?
So it varies by country, obviously. It varies by state in the United States. And it also is subjective, right? So any law enforcement agent does have the ability to request and in some cases require. It doesn't mean you have to comply necessarily, but the jurisdictions, the agency itself, so whether it's customs or immigration and customs enforcement, or it's the FBI, they all have different jurisdictions. I'm not really sure how to even answer this question because I think it's very context sensitive. That said, in many cases, search and seizure isn't even necessary, right? A lot of the information that law enforcement is looking for, you've already published somewhere, whether it's in on a Facebook wall or it's in a traffic camera that took a picture of your license plate. Most of this information you've already given away. But I think the mobile devices become central to the law enforcement search and seizure conversation because it seems like the most obvious place to collect this data. I think once law enforcement gets smarter about where this data actually is, that they'll figure out that they actually don't need access to the device to collect the kinds of information that they're looking for. But search and seizure, that's a tough one, and I'm not even really sure which states today actually require you to hand over your device in the first place, but hand over things like passwords and PINs. It's a good question.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question, we're hoping to get two more in. So, are some devices better than others for privacy? Example, Android versus iPhone?
So let's take those two to start with. I'd say generally speaking, if the devices are about equal. One of the problems I had with the Apple FBI debate was that everyone was looking at the FBI as the collector of information. But I can tell you right now that there is no bigger collector of it, an abuser, by the way, of privacy and information on the planet than Apple. Right? This is the same company that not long before the whole terrorist case in San Bernardino that stuffed my iPhone full of U2 MP3s without ever asking me. And so Apple, I think got some good press out of it, pretending to be a privacy advocate when they are anything but. So, I think that conversation needs to be had. And I think we've let the problem get so out of hand at this point that I'm not sure there's a lot of reconciliation, particularly around companies like Google and Apple, these massive tech giants that there's so much momentum in their direction. I think it would be difficult for anyone other than the federal government to require different behavior from them. And then again, what would probably happen, at least in the United States, where convenience is king, if the federal government went to Apple and said, hey, listen, you got to stop collecting geolocation, you got to stop collecting, keystrokes, you got to stop collecting privacy information and configurations, you got to stop collecting search histories, you got to. What Apple would do is say, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Consumer, the federal government is requiring that I stop collecting all this information. I'm willing to comply. Here are all of the features and functions and conveniences that you're going to have to give up, and society would absolutely rebel. So, I think the question again comes back to, is it worth it, right? So all the information that we exchange and our privacy that we're willing to compromise, is it worth it for the things that we get for that? And again, I don't think the formula has evolved to a point where we understand it enough to make a good decision.
Okay, thank you. One last question is, someone wanted a little bit more information on that law that's being considered in New York regarding the textualizer. Yeah.
It's a simple Google search away. I forget the bill number, but just Google search New York State textualizer. It's T-E-X-T-A-L-I-Z-E-R, and there's tons of articles out there about it. And I haven't checked on it in a couple of months, so I'm not exactly sure where it is.
Okay, excellent. So it's just about 4 o'clock. So we are going to wrap things up. A recording of this webcast will be available on the website for CIS. So again, Reg, thank you so much. I think that was a absolute excellent presentation, very eye-opening. And we thank you, and thank you everyone for participating. Hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time. Feel free to connect with me on social media. Thanks.